You know, it's funny. If you wanted to completely disappear today, you'd probably start by trying to erase your digital footprint,
Well,
right?
absolutely. You'd go straight for the internet presence.
Right, like you'd sit down at your laptop, delete your social media accounts, wipe your hard drives, maybe toss your smartphone into the nearest river if you were really serious about it.
Which sounds extreme, but yeah, that's what it takes now.
Exactly. You'd probably start exclusively using cash, wearing hats and sunglasses to avoid facial recognition cameras. Because, we think of identity today as this incredibly sticky, complex digital web that is just almost impossible to untangle yourself from.
It really is. It's everywhere.
But I want you to imagine for a second that you had to do the exact same thing, like completely obliterate your identity and your family's entire ancestral identity, but you had to do it 400 or 500 years ago, and your life, quite literally, depended on you doing it successfully.
It is a terrifying thought experiment, really. I mean, when we look back at the 15th, 16th, and 17th centuries, your identity was not a digital footprint hanging in the cloud. It was an incredibly physical, heavy paper trail.
Right, lots of ink and parchment.
Exactly. It existed in municipal ledgers, in these heavy leather-bound parish registries, in tax records kept in the vaults of local cathedrals, and the ink was permanent. The oversight was absolute.
So it wasn't like you could just hack a server and delete yourself.
Not at all. And if the wrong person in authority followed that specific paper trail, the consequences were not just, a fine or public embarrassment. The consequences were lethal. You could be imprisoned, tortured, and actually burned at the stake.
Wow. So, welcome to this deep dive. Today, we are going on a serious historical, linguistic, and honestly, a genealogical journey. We're going to explore one of the most enigmatic, frankly mind-bending chapters in the history of the Western Sephardic diaspora.
It really is a massive puzzle.
It is, and our mission for this deep dive is to uncover exactly how Spanish and Portuguese Jews used their very names as camouflage to survive centuries of relentless persecution. We're going to look at how this hunted population turned the massive, lumbering bureaucracy of the Spanish Empire into a weapon of survival.
And to guide us through this maze, we are pulling insights from a truly fascinating stack of sources today.
Yeah, we've got a lot of ground to cover.
We do. We're leaning heavily on academic research papers covering Iberian history, alongside historical books, specifically Stanley M. Hoard's incredible and exhaustive work, To the End of the Earth.
Such a good book.
Oh, it's foundational. We're also incorporating recent news articles regarding citizenship laws in Spain and Portugal, and the highly specific, honestly incredibly strict, official genealogical guidelines published by bodies like the Sephardic Genealogical Society.
So we're looking at a synthesis of history, linguistics, archival forensics, and even modern genetics, right?
Exactly, pulling from all those disciplines.
Well, I have to admit, when I first started reading through this source material, the central mystery just baffled me.
How so?
Well, when modern researchers or genealogists try to trace family lineages in Western Sephardic trade hubs, places like Amsterdam or London, or across the Spanish Caribbean and the Americas, the records just seem to break.
They completely shatter.
Right, the continuity shatters. You'll be tracking a family line, and surnames completely vanish within a single generation. You'll find documentation of two brothers born of the exact same parents in the same town who grow up to have entirely different last names.
Which makes no sense to a modern researcher at first glance.
Exactly. You'll find ancient Hebrew titles hidden underneath what look like completely random geographic aliases. It's wild.
It is, but if you approach this history with a modern bureaucratic mindset, it is very easy to misinterpret the data.
Because we expect consistency.
Right. You look at those colonial registries and you think that the record keeping in the 16th and 17th centuries was just absolute chaos. You assume it was sloppy administrative work by colonial clerks who just didn't care about spelling or consistency.
Just lazy record keeping.
That's what people used to think. But what archival scholarship has definitively proven over the last few decades is that this was not administrative sloppiness at all. It was a highly calculated, incredibly sophisticated survival mechanism.
Okay, let's unpack this.
Every seemingly random error, every dropped surname, every sudden change in identity was put there on purpose. We are looking at a system known as Onomastic Steganography, and name shuffling.
Onomastic steganography.
Yeah.
Hiding in plain sight, using the names you choose to call yourself. I mean, it is a phenomenal concept.
That's brilliant.
But to understand why a family would ever need to intentionally obliterate its own paper trail and literally sever its historical ties to its own ancestors, we have to go back to the catalyst, don't we?
We have to look at the rupture, yes.
We have to understand the moment their original identities were outlawed.
Right, and the historical catalysts here are two massive traumatic events at the very end of the 15th century.
Okay, set the scene for us.
First, you have the 1492 Edict of Expulsion in Spain. This was issued by the Catholic monarchs, Ferdinand and Isabella.
Right. Everybody learns about 1492.
Exactly. But what this decree did was give the Jewish population of Spain a stark, terrifying choice. Either convert to Catholicism or leave the country immediately. And if you left, you were forced to leave almost all of your wealth behind.
And a huge portion of them chose to flee, right? I mean, they crossed the border into Portugal thinking they'd be safe there.
They did. Tens of thousands of Spanish Jews paid exorbitant fees to the Portuguese king John II for temporary asylum.
But the safety was basically an illusion.
Completely. Because just 5 years later, in 1497, King John's successor, King Manuel I, well, he wanted to marry the daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella.
Ah, royal politics.
Always. And the Spanish monarchs demanded that Portugal be, quote-unquote, cleansed of Jews as a condition of the marriage. But Manuel was in a bind. He didn't want to lose the immense economic and intellectual capital of the Jewish population by actually expelling them.
Right, because they were doctors, merchants, scholars.
Exactly. So instead of letting them leave, he trapped them.
He closed the ports.
He closed the ports. He gathered the Jewish population in Lisbon under the pretense of providing them ships to leave, and instead he subjected them to mass forced baptisms.
Wow.
Priests just threw holy water over crowds of thousands. Overnight, hundreds of thousands of Jews were officially and legally converted to Roman Catholicism by royal decree.
Just overnight. I mean, think about the psychological violence of that. An entire population's religious, cultural, and historical existence is suddenly made illegal.
In an instant.
Everything you are, everything your family has been for centuries on the Iberian Peninsula is erased with a splash of water and a royal signature.
And this sudden forced assimilation created an entirely new social and legal class in the Iberian Peninsula. They were known as conversos.
Conversos.
Yeah.
And there was a Hebrew term too, right?
Yes. In Hebrew, they were often referred to as enusim, which translates to the coerced ones, or the forced ones. In official Spanish and Portuguese documents, they were called Cristianos Nuevos, or New Christians.
Right, New Christians.
But the transition from Jew to New Christian was not just a matter of, changing where you worshipped on the Sabbath. The mechanics of these forced baptisms meant a complete legal re-registration of every human being involved.
I read about this legal re-registration process in our sources, and this is where the naming conventions get deeply complicated.
Very complicated.
Explain how the state actually recorded this transformation, because it wasn't just a spiritual ceremony, was it?
Far from it. Baptism in the Catholic Church at this time was the primary mechanism by which the state recognized your legal existence. There were no birth certificates issued by a hospital.
Right, the church was the state.
The parish registry was the state registry. When these forced baptisms occurred, the newly baptized new Christians were required to have old Christian godparents.
Okay, so the state says you need an old Christian sponsor.
Exactly. These godparents were legally sponsoring their entry into the faith.
And these godparents were often just random people, right? Like complete strangers or maybe local nobility or wealthy landowners who were participating in the mass baptisms as a show of piety.
Frequently, yes. And the critical bureaucratic element here, the part that ruins the paper trail, is that these old Christian godparents would frequently assign their own surnames to the newly baptized individuals.
Let me make sure I'm grasping the scale of this. If my name is, say, Moshe, and my family has been living in Toledo or Lisbon for 500 years under a specific Hebrew or Arabic-influenced surname, and my state-mandated old Christian godparent happens to be some minor nobleman named João Fernandes, I am now legally recorded in the municipal registry as João Fernandes.
That is the exact mechanism of erasure. Your family's historical surname, which might trace its lineage all the way back to the Levant, is completely obliterated from the official record.
It's gone.
Gone. You are now Fernandez, or the Costa, a Pereira, a Rodriguez, a Gomes, or a Enrique.
Wow.
This phenomenon is entirely responsible for why those specific, very common Iberian surnames became absolutely ubiquitous among Portuguese and Spanish converso communities. They were surnames of necessity, assigned from the top down.
Reading that brought up a very specific visual for me. It reminded me of the classic trope of immigrants arriving at Ellis Island in New York in the early 20th century.
Oh, I see where you're going.
You hear the myth all the time,
It's
right?
true.
An exhausted, overworked immigration official looks at an immigrant with a long, complex Eastern European surname, size, and just writes down Smith or Johnson on the intake form.
The Ellis Island comparison captures the sudden shift in identity, sure, but there's a crucial nuance we need to add to that analogy.
What's that?
Well, at Ellis Island, the motivation was usually linguistic friction or bureaucratic laziness. In 1490s Iberia, it was an intentional, systemic weaponization of identity.
It was done at sword point.
Exactly. The goal was to sever the ancestral chain so completely that the Jewish lineage could never be reconstructed.
That makes perfect sense. It was the forced assignment of a generic identity to destroy a specific one. But going through the guidelines from the Sephardic Genealogical Society, they emphasize this next point incredibly heavily.
No, they have to.
Because this forced renaming introduces a massive, frustrating complication for modern researchers today. If you are sitting at home looking at your family tree and you see that your great-great-grandfather was named Acosta or Rodriguez, you cannot automatically assume you have Sephardic descent.
You absolutely cannot. Millions of non-Jewish Iberians, the old Christians, already shared those exact names for centuries before the forced conversions.
Right, because the names belong to the godparents.
Right? They were the names of the nobility, the landowners, and the common laborers. The new Christians were simply dumped into that pre-existing massive naming pool. A surname like Gomes is just a bucket.
A bucket. I like that.
Yeah, and you have no immediate way of knowing if the family inside that bucket were old Christians who had been Catholic for 1,000 years or new Christians who were forcibly baptized in 1497.
Which, when you think about it, is ironically exactly what made them impossible to track individually in a crowd. I mean, if everyone in the town is named Fernandez, how does the local inquisitor find the converso Fernandez?
It creates a lot of static in the records.
But reading through the research, this raised a huge logistical question for me. If everyone suddenly has the exact same generic surnames, how on earth did crypto-Jews find each other?
That is the million-dollar question.
Because if you're trying to secretly maintain your faith, observe the Sabbath, and eventually marry your children to other secretly Jewish families, how do you signal to one another without alerting the old Christian neighbor living right next door?
This is the moment where human ingenuity under the most extreme pressure becomes truly astounding. That exact problem, the absolute necessity to signal your true identity to your peers while remaining invisible to the authorities, gave birth to an incredibly sophisticated system of linguistic camouflage.
And what did that look like?
The conversos began adopting and utilizing what we call toponyms, as well as nature-based names, as an active defense mechanism.
Ploponyms, break that down for us. That means place names, right? Like surnames tied to a specific geographic location.
That is the literal definition, yeah.
Oh.
Poponyms are surnames derived from towns, cities, or regions. Think of names like Toledano from Toledo, Soriano from Soria, Sevilla, or Navarro.
Okay, that makes sense.
And alongside these geographic markers, they heavily adopted nature-based surnames. We see a massive influx of names like Rios, which translates to rivers, Arroyo for stream, Fuentes for fountains, Montes for mountains, or Silva for forest.
I was actually stuck on this while reviewing the sources. Yeah, why nature names? Aren't those also relatively common Iberian names? I feel like naming yourself after a forest doesn't inherently sound Jewish.
That is the sheer brilliance of the strategy. To an old Christian neighbor, a tax collector, or a suspicious parish priest, a name like Silva or Rios is completely innocuous.
It just sounds normal.
It sounds perfectly normal. It blends into the pastoral landscape of Spain and Portugal perfectly. But within the clandestine converso network, these specific categories of names began to function as a discrete signaling system.
Ah, I see.
There were subtle markers. They allowed families to recognize one another, to know who was secretly part of the Nação, the nation, without openly declaring it in the town square.
So it functions almost like a secret handshake, but it's printed on your legal tax document.
Exactly. And the term for this, which we touched on earlier, is steganography.
Right, onomastic steganography.
Yes, and it is vital to separate steganography from cryptography because they operate on completely different philosophies of secrecy.
Post.
Well, cryptography is when you scramble a message so that it looks like gibberish. You use an enigma machine or a cipher. If an inquisitor intercepts a cryptographic message, they might not be able to read what it says, but they immediately know it is a secret message.
Right, the cipher itself screams, I am hiding something illegal.
Precisely. The very existence of the code proves you are guilty of something. Steganography, on the other hand, hides the very existence of the secret message within an ordinary, non-suspicious medium.
The medium itself provides the camouflage.
Exactly. If an inquisitor intercepts a steganographic message, they don't even realize they are looking at a secret. They just think they are looking at a mundane painting, a normal letter about the weather, or, in this historical case, a perfectly standard municipal registry of births and deaths.
The secret is hidden in plain sight, invisible to anyone who doesn't know how to look for it.
That's it exactly.
You know, I used the Ellis Island analogy earlier, but trying to visualize the steganography, a different idea came to mind.
Let's hear it.
Here's where it gets really interesting. It's like trying to pass a secret manifesto for a political rebellion to your allies, but you hide the instructions inside a totally mundane grocery list.
Oh, I like that.
Right. To the casual observer or the police officer who searches your pockets, it's just a list of milk, eggs, bread, and apples. But to the initiated rebel who knows, say, the first letter of every item spells out a meeting location, it is a detailed map.
The grocery list analogy is conceptually perfect because it relies on the same mechanism, the mundane obscuring the illicit. But the conversos elevated this far beyond simple secret codes.
They did.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
They didn't just use random nature names. They tapped into deeply intellectual ancient rabbinic traditions to encode these names. They used a system known as notaricon.
Now, I spent a lot of time reading the linguistic sources on this because it just blew my mind. But before we talk about how the conversos used it to hide from the Inquisition, explain what notaricon actually is from an authentic, traditional rabbinic perspective. It wasn't invented as a survival tool, was it?
No, it was not. Notaricon is a classic, deeply respected Jewish hermeneutic tool. It has been used for many centuries in Talmudic and Kabbalistic commentary to interpret scriptures.
So it's a scholarly method.
Very much so. It sits alongside other analytical practices like gematria, which deals with the numerical values of Hebrew letters, and temura, which involves letter substitution ciphers. Notaricon is specifically the practice of forming acrostics or deriving acronyms from the initial or final letters of words.
The sources gave a few famous examples of this in traditional rabbinic circles.
The most universal examples are the names of the great scholars themselves. In the Jewish tradition, it is very common to refer to towering intellectual figures by acronyms derived from their titles and names.
Right.
So the great medieval commentator Rabbi Shlomo Yitzchaki is known across the world simply as Rashi.
Rashi. Got it.
The philosopher Rabbi Moshe ben Maimon is known as Rambam. Another excellent example is the surname Bachar, which stands for the Hebrew phrase Ben Shavad Rabbi, meaning son of an honored rabbi. These are acronym surnames.
So picture the scene. You have these highly literate, highly educated Sephardic scholars. They are suddenly forced to live under strict, suffocating Catholic rule. Their books are burned, their schools are closed, and they take this ancient Talmudic tool of biblical analysis, this notaricon, and they actively weaponize it for physical survival.
They subtly, masterfully integrated these acrostic principles into the Iberian parish registries. They turned the oppressor's paperwork against them.
Give us an example of how they did that.
Let's look at the Spanish surnames Bolea or Bena. To a Catholic priest recording a baptism or a marriage, Bena is just a name. It draws no attention.
Just a standard entry in the ledger.
Right. But to the family passing it down, Bena covertly encodes the Hebrew phrase, Ben Abraham, son of Abraham.
Yeah.
They hid the underlying Jewish family initials right there in the official Catholic register, under the nose of the priest.
I am struck by the sheer audacity of that. You are standing in a Catholic church, participating in a sacrament forced upon you, and you are secretly recording your allegiance to the Jewish patriarchs in the priest's own ledger.
It's an incredible act of defiance.
It really is, but the acronyms were only half of the strategy. The sources also detail a semantic element to this camouflage that I found even more fascinating.
Yes, the semantic translation is arguably even more widespread than the acronyms. This is the method where you take the fundamental literal meaning of your ancient Hebrew name and translate it directly into the local vernacular language.
Whether that's Spanish, Portuguese, or French.
Exactly.
The example that really clarified this for me in the reading was the name Caspi.
That is the perfect case study. Take the Hebrew root word for silver, which is kasef. A common historical Jewish surname derived from this might be Caspi.
Okay, so you have the name Caspi.
Right. And if you are living in 15th century Aragon or Castile, and you are forced to abandon the openly Jewish name Caspi, you simply adopt the literal translation of the metal.
So you just call yourself Silver in whatever language is spoken there.
Exactly. If you migrate into French-speaking territories, your family becomes L'Argent. If you stay in Spanish territories, you become Plata.
The underlying Hebrew meaning completely survives. The soul of the name remains intact, but it's wrapped safely inside this vernacular, culturally acceptable disguise. A Catholic official sees a man named Plata and thinks nothing of it.
But the man named Plata knows exactly who he is, and his convoso neighbors know exactly who he is.
You know, the tension of maintaining that double life is almost unimaginable to us today. On one hand, you have the profound thrill and the sacred duty of preserving your ancient heritage for the next generation.
Yes.
But on the other hand, the lethal danger of being caught. If an inquisitor discovered that your family selectively chose the name Bena to honor Abraham, the stakes were absolute.
There was no trial, as we would understand it today. You would be stripped of your property, tortured in the secret prisons of the Inquisition to give up your accomplices, and potentially executed in an auto da fe.
It is a masterclass in psychological resilience. They absolutely refuse to be entirely erased. The state forced them into a specific mold, but they essentially hollowed out the inside of that mold and filled it with their own secret cultural architecture.
That's a beautiful way to phrase it.
But as I read further into Horde's book, To the End of the Earth, a major contradiction jumped out at me.
What did you find?
Well, if they had developed such a brilliant functional system for surviving in Europe, if the steganography was working, why risk it all to cross the ocean to the Americas? I mean, the transatlantic journey was perilous. Disease, pirates, shipwrecks.
It was incredibly dangerous.
Right. And more importantly, how did they even get past the colonial authorities to reach the Spanish Caribbean? If their new Christian status was recorded in the ledgers, wouldn't the empire stop them from leaving?
That's a great point. The motivation to leave Europe was driven by increasing pressure. The camouflage was brilliant, yes, but the Inquisition in the Iberian Peninsula was becoming terrifyingly efficient.
So it was getting too hot.
Way too hot. The economic walls were closing in. Informants were everywhere. Fleeing the Inquisition's immediate dense grip required heading to the frontiers of the New World.
Because there's just more space.
The Americas offered vast spaces, distance from the crown, and immense economic opportunity and trade. But you hit on the crucial barrier. Crossing the Atlantic meant tricking one of the most obsessive, highly regulated bureaucratic empires in human history.
Getting to the Spanish Caribbean wasn't just a matter of buying a ticket in Seville and walking up the gangplank of a galleon. You had to clear customs, and 16th century Spanish customs were terrifying.
They were. Migration to the Americas was strictly regulated by the Spanish colonial administration, specifically managed by an institution called the Casa de Contratación, the House of Trade located in Seville.
And the Casa enforced these incredibly strict statutes, right? The limpieza de sangre laws, the purity of blood laws. I read about these. They were essentially early racial purity laws, weren't they?
They were genealogical purity laws, absolutely. Under these statutes, new Christians, meaning anyone with Jewish or Muslim ancestry, regardless of how many generations ago their family converted to Catholicism, were legally banned from migrating to the Americas. The Spanish crown was deeply paranoid. They wanted to ensure that their New World colonies remained entirely free of any quote-unquote heretical influence. They wanted to build a pure, uncorrupted Catholic utopia across the Atlantic.
So if the port authorities in Seville are checking your paperwork, demanding proof from your local parish that your blood is pure, going back 4 generations, how does a massive population of crypto-Jews end up settling in places like Puerto Rico, Hispaniola, and Cuba? How did they beat the border control?
To bypass the Casa de Contratación, Sephardim relied on what might be the ultimate bureaucratic evasion tactic. We call it name shuffling.
Name shuffling.
Yes. They completely subverted the standard, rigid Iberian naming practices to create fragmented, untrackable, fluid identities.
Okay, I want to spend some time on this, because understanding how they broke the rules requires understanding what the rules actually were. How is a person supposed to be named in Spain or Portugal during this era? What was the legal standard?
In standard Iberian naming practice, which largely persists today, actually a person typically bears 2 surnames. The convention is the father's first surname, followed by the mother's first surname. It is a highly logical system.
It makes sense.
It creates a very clear, easily traceable, linear path of inheritance and identity.
Yeah.
It allows the state, the church, and the tax collectors to know exactly who you are, who your parents are, and where your wealth comes from.
It is basically a genealogical map printed directly on your birth certificate. So how did the conversos break it?
They introduced extreme, deliberate fluidity into the system. They began treating surnames not as permanent genetic markers, but as interchangeable cloaks.
Interchangeable cloaks.
Yes. If we look at colonial parish and land grant records in the interior highlands of Puerto Rico, towns like Utuado, Xuntas, and San Sebastian, we see this phenomenon happening in real time in the archives.
What do you see?
A single individual might show up in the historical records under multiple, completely different legal names, depending entirely on the context of the document.
Wait, I want to clarify this. You don't mean different people in the same family. You mean the exact same person using different names.
The exact same individual.
That's wild.
Let's trace a documented pattern. At birth, a child might be baptized by the local priest, using primarily their mother's surname, ignoring the father's line entirely.
Okay, that breaks the rule right there.
Right. And then, 30 years later, when that same man is purchasing a farm or applying for a royal land grant, he might register the deed using a maternal grandmother's lineage, completely dropping his birth name.
Wow.
And then, 10 years after that, if he is drafted into the local Spanish militia rosters, he adopts a completely different alias, pulled from an uncle's line.
So you have one guy walking around a mountain town in Puerto Rico. To the parish priest, he's one guy. To the colonial tax collector, he's another guy. And to the militia captain, he's a third guy. Can you walk me through a specific example of how extreme this name change could be because the sources were full of these dizzying family trees?
Let's construct a scenario based on the archival patterns Hoards uncovered.
Okay.
Imagine an individual whose full, technically accurate family lineage might make him Diego Delgado da Silva.
Diego Delgado da Silva.
Right. But when he relocates from the coast into the isolated mountains of Puerto Rico to avoid colonial oversight, he drops both the Delgado and the Silva. He registers himself in the new town as Diego Montes de Oca.
So he just completely rebrands.
He has reached back into a secondary, distant maternal branch to find a name that has absolutely no immediate connection to his father's public identity.
But why go through all that trouble? It sounds exhausting to juggle 3 different legal identities in a small agrarian community. What is the actual threat they are mitigating by doing this?
To understand the threat, we have to look at how the Inquisition actually functioned as a law enforcement agency across the Atlantic.
They weren't just in Europe.
Not at all. The Holy Office established massive investigative tribunals in major New World hubs, places like Cartagena de Indias in modern-day Colombia, Lima in Peru, and Mexico City.
Right.
And these inquisitors were not just religious zealots, they were highly organized bureaucrats. They relied on massive written indices. They relied on cross-referencing ledger entries sent from Spain to hunt down heresy in the colonies.
You know, when I was reading about their methods, it struck me that they were essentially running an early paper-based search algorithm.
That is exactly what it was. It was a manual 16th century search algorithm.
Exactly.
If an Inquisition investigator in Cartagena receives a tip from Spain to track down a suspected Judaizer named Diego Delgado da Silva, how do they find him? They open their massive ledgers and they look under D for Delgado. Or maybe they cross-reference under S for Silva.
Right, they check the index.
They send letters to the governors of Cuba and Puerto Rico asking if anyone by that name has paid taxes. But if Diego has moved to the mountains of Utuado and is living legally, buying land and paying taxes as Diego Montes de Oca,
the search algorithm completely fails.
It fails. The paper trail simply disappears into the jungle. By intentionally breaking the paternal naming convention, they broke the Inquisition's ability to track them across borders.
I was trying to think of a modern equivalent for this, and the best I could come up with is a tech company diversifying its server locations to prevent a single point of failure.
Oh, that's a great analogy.
Right. If you keep all your data on one server and a hacker breaches it, your entire network goes down.
Yes.
The Inquisition in Seville was the hacker. If they arrested one family member and got their name, they could find everyone. But by name shuffling, the family members in Puerto Rico or Cuba act as decentralized servers. They remain completely invisible and online because they aren't using the compromised network. They aren't using the same surname.
The server analogy is incredibly accurate because it highlights the strategy of mitigating systemic risk. And historian Stanley M. Hoards documented the most extreme version of this specific tactic extensively in his research across the frontier regions of the Spanish Empire.
What did he find?
He found that full siblings children, born to the exact same mother and father, raised in the exact same house, would routinely and deliberately choose entirely different surnames as they reached adulthood.
Wait, so you would have a family dinner, and one brother goes by the surname Torres, the second brother is legally known as Maldonado, and the third brother signs all his documents as Ramos, even though they have the exact same parents.
Yes. They deliberately fractionated the legal footprint of the family. The logic was grim but flawless.
Walk us through the logic.
If all three brothers shared the name Torres, and one brother was arrested by the Inquisition in Mexico City, tortured, and forced to confess his secret Jewish practices,
They would look for the others.
the Inquisition would immediately send orders to round up every other Torres in the region. The entire family would be wiped out in a single sweep.
But if they have different names?
If the brothers are known legally as Torres, Maldonado, and Ramos, the arrest of Torres does not instantly expose Maldonado and Ramos. The bureaucratic link between them does not exist on paper.
I have to pause here because the emotional toll of that tactic is just staggering when you really think about it. You are deliberately severing the public, legal, historical ties to your own flesh and blood. You are essentially legally disowning your siblings, so that if one of you falls to the Inquisition, the others can survive. It looks like familial estrangement on paper, but it is actually an act of profound, desperate love.
You are touching on the core psychological reality of the converso experience. It was an existence entirely defined by compartmentalization.
The public truth versus the private truth.
Exactly. The public truth and the private truth were entirely divorced from one another. You had the face you showed the colonial governor and the face you showed your children behind closed shutters on a Friday night. But as you can imagine, this brilliance in the 16th century creates a massive, seemingly insurmountable paradox for the future.
Right, because this is an incredibly clever way to survive the Inquisition. But if they successfully erased their paper trails, burned their bridges, and shuffled their names to confuse the Spanish authorities, didn't they also accidentally erase their trails for their own descendants?
They absolutely did.
Because if I am looking for my ancestors today in 2026, and my ancestors purposefully destroyed the evidence of who they were to stay alive, how on earth do I find them?
That exact paradox is why modern genealogy, for Western Sephardic descendants, is so incredibly difficult. It is less about reading a simple linear family tree and more about solving a centuries-old forensic cold case.
It's like trying to solve a crime where the victims hid the evidence.
The camouflage they built was so effective it worked almost too well. It hid them from the Inquisition, but it also hid them from their great-grandchildren.
So what does this all mean for you, the listener? I mean, if you are sitting at home looking at your family tree and you see names like Rivera or Torres or Cruz or Silva, I mean, a lot of people see those names, read a little bit of history, and immediately think, aha, I have a converso surname. I have Sephardic Jewish ancestry.
And that is the most crucial foundational takeaway we need to emphasize today, based on the absolute academic consensus and the strict guidelines of organizations like the Sephardic Genealogical Society.
What's the takeaway?
A surname alone, no matter how famous it is in the history of the diaspora, is never standalone proof of Sephardic Jewish lineage.
Never.
Never. Surnames like Rivera, Torres, Cruz, and Delgado absolutely reflect normal, ubiquitous Hispanic naming customs.
Because they've been used by everyone for centuries.
Over the centuries, these names were shared by old Christians who migrated from Spain, by new Christians fleeing the Inquisition, by indigenous Taino populations who were baptized by the Spanish, and by enslaved Afro-Caribbean communities who were given the surnames of their enslavers.
So the name doesn't belong to just one group.
The name is just the outer shell. It tells you absolutely nothing definitive about the genetic, cultural, or religious history of the specific person who carried it.
It's like finding a Ford in a massive parking lot. It doesn't tell you anything about who is driving the car. It just tells you they bought a popular brand of vehicle.
That is exactly it.
So if the name isn't enough, and the paper trail was intentionally scrambled, how are researchers and descendants actually proving this ancestry today? I know Spain and Portugal recently had citizenship laws for descendants of Sephardic Jews. How do you prove your case to a modern government? How do you see through the steganography?
To see through the camouflage, modern researchers, historians, and the Sephardic Genealogical Society rely on a strict methodology we can call the triad of evidence.
The triad of evidence.
Yes, you cannot rely on just one clue. You need 3 distinct, robust pillars to support a verifiable claim of crypto-Jewish ancestry in the Caribbean or the Americas.
I was reading through the Society's guidelines, and they are incredibly demanding. They don't just accept a family tree you built online, they require this triad. Let's break it down. What is the first pillar they look for?
The first pillar is archival documentation, and this is where we find perhaps the deepest, most satisfying historical irony in this entire story.
Well, I love this part.
To prove a lineage, researchers must look for direct, unbroken references in colonial notary records, land grants, and birth registries. But the ultimate, undisputed proof often comes from the Procesos de la Inquisición, the actual transcribed trial dossiers of the Spanish and Portuguese Inquisitions.
Wait, I want to make sure I'm grasping the irony here. The very institution that systematically tortured them, burned them at the stake, and tried to exterminate their culture, kept such meticulous, obsessive bureaucratic records of their interrogations and genealogies that those exact records are now being used by descendants to reclaim the heritage the Inquisition tried to steal.
That is exactly the reality.
That is amazing.
The Inquisition's own obsessive paperwork has become the key to undoing their erasure. When the Inquisition arrested a suspected Judaizer, they were incredibly thorough.
They wrote everything down.
Everything. In those trial dossiers, some of which are hundreds of pages long, inquisitors would force the suspect to list their parents, their grandparents, their aunts, their uncles, and their children.
They wanted to find the whole network.
The inquisitors were trying to map the heretical network to arrest more people. Today, modern genealogists go into the archives in Madrid, Lisbon, or Mexico City, pull those horrific maps, and use them to trace family lines definitively back to the Iberian Peninsula before the expulsions.
That is incredible. The meticulousness of the evil became the instrument of its own defeat. Okay, so pillar one is the archival documentation finding the actual paper trail, even if it is buried in an Inquisition confession file.
Yes.
I want to bring up the second pillar because when I was looking at the guidelines, I was fascinated by this concept. It is called onomastic endogamy.
It is a critical behavioral marker.
Now, endogamy is the practice of marrying strictly within a specific social, ethnic, or religious group, right?
That is correct. Because the conversos were living in a constant state of justified paranoia, they could not trust outsiders.
Because an outsider might betray them.
Exactly. If you reveal your secret Sabbath observance to an old Christian spouse, they could turn you over to the authorities for a reward. So they married strictly within their own tight-knit, clandestine networks for generations.
So the researchers are saying it is not just about what your ancestors' names were, it is about who your family consistently chose to marry over the centuries.
Precisely. If you find one ancestor in your tree named Torres, that proves absolutely nothing. But if you look at the parish marriage records and you see that for 200 years in a specific mountain town in Puerto Rico, the Torres family only married the Maldonado family, the Silva family, and the Ramos family.
And no one else.
And they entirely avoided marrying outside that specific cluster, even when it was geographically inconvenient. That behavioral pattern is a massive glowing indicator. You have to look past the camouflage of the individual name and look at the aggregate behavior of the community.
You are looking for the invisible network. I was trying to conceptualize this, and it feels like tracking dark matter in space.
Dark matter.
Yeah, astronomers can't actually see dark matter itself, but they know it is there because they can see how its immense gravity pulls on all the visible stars and galaxies around it.
I see what you mean.
The endogamy, this strict centuries-long marriage pattern, is the gravitational pull of a secret community. You can't see the Jewish faith on paper, but you can see the gravity of their marriage choices.
And that is a beautiful and highly accurate way to visualize the archival research process. You are mapping the gravity of the secret. And that leads us to the final and most modern pillar of the triad, genetic genealogy.
The DNA testing. This is where a lot of people start today, right? They spit in a tube, send it to a company, and wait for the pie chart to tell them who they are.
Yes, but I got a little confused reading the scientific papers on this. The researchers aren't just looking at the standard consumer autosomal DNA tests, are they? They are not, and this is a critical distinction that trips up a lot of amateur genealogists.
Why is that?
DNA is an incredibly powerful tool, but it is not magic, and it has limitations depending on what you're looking for. Consumer autosomal DNA tests, the ones that give you the ethnic pie charts, are great for finding recent cousins.
Like second or third cousins.
Right. But autosomal DNA recombines with every generation. It gets chopped up and diluted. Trying to use autosomal DNA to pinpoint a specific Sephardic ancestor from the year 1500 is incredibly difficult because the signal degrades over time.
So if the autosomal DNA gets too diluted over 500 years, what are the genetic genealogists actually looking at to prove this Iberian lineage?
Serious researchers look at two highly stable genetic markers. First, they look at Y-DNA, which traces the direct, unbroken paternal line father to son to son.
Because that doesn't recombine in the same way.
Exactly. Y-DNA mutates very slowly, so it can trace lineages back thousands of years. Second, they look at mtDNA, or mitochondrial DNA, which traces the direct, unbroken maternal line mother to daughter to daughter.
And what are they hoping to find in those specific lines?
They are looking for specific genetic signatures, called haplogroups, that point definitively toward Levantine, Eastern Mediterranean, and Iberian Sephardic ancestral clusters.
But the DNA cannot stand alone, right? Having a Mediterranean haplogroup doesn't mean you are specifically descended from a crypto-Jew in cranial Cuba.
Exactly. And that is why the triad is a triad. The genetic data must be supported by the archival paper trail, and it must be contextualized by the behavioral evidence of endogamy.
So they all have to interlock.
When all three of those pillars align perfectly, when you have the Inquisition document, the endogamous marriage patterns in the colonial registry, and the Y-DNA pointing to the Levant, that is how you prove an identity today. You are effectively reverse engineering the camouflage that was built half a millennium ago.
So what does this all mean for us today? It means that if you are exploring Western Sephardic genealogy, you are essentially acting as a historical forensic detective.
You really are.
The witnesses, your own ancestors, intentionally destroyed the evidence of who they were to protect themselves from being murdered by the state. They left behind decoys, they shuffled their names, they used ancient rabbinic acronyms disguised as Catholic surnames.
They did everything they could to confuse the record.
Right, so you cannot just trust the name painted on the mailbox. You have to test the foundation of the house itself. You have to look at the genetics, the marriage records, and the hidden gravity of their choices.
It is one of the most remarkable journeys in human history. What began as a traumatic, violent rupture, the stripping away of identity, culture, and homeland in 1492 and 1497, was transformed by these brilliant families into a defensive maze of words.
A maze of words.
They took the oppressor's language, the Catholic parish registries, and the very bureaucratic concept of a surname, and they forged them into a shield. They used their new names to preserve their ancient heritage in secret, passing the ember down through the generations until a time came when it could safely be uncovered again.
It is just an astounding story of survival against all odds. We have traced this journey from forced conversions at Sword Point in Lisbon, to hiding Hebrew acronyms in mundane parish records, to siblings deliberately taking completely different names in the Puerto Rican highlands to shatter the Inquisition's paper search algorithms.
It is an absolute masterclass in resistance.
It is. But as we synthesize all of this, it raises a profound philosophical question, and it is something I think about often when reviewing these archival cases.
What's the question?
Think about the immense psychological weight of this multi-generational performance. Imagine knowing your true ancient ancestral identity, but being forced to pass down a mask to your children for their own safety.
Yes.
Generation after generation, you teach them how to wear the mask. You teach them to answer to a name that isn't truly theirs. At what point does the mask become the reality?
That is the tragedy of it all.
If a family successfully hides for 400 years, relying entirely on secret codes, shuffled surnames, and whispered traditions that eventually, inevitably fade from the conscious memory of the descendants, how does the soul of an identity survive when the very words used to describe it have been forcibly erased from the tongue?
That is a heavy, beautiful thought to linger on as we close out. If you erase the paper trail to survive the fire, how do you make sure you don't accidentally erase yourself in the process?
It really brings us back to the thought experiment we started with today. If you delete your digital footprint today to disappear into the woods, are you still the exact same person when you walk out the other side? These converso families managed to disappear into the ledgers of an empire, and hundreds of years later, their descendants are finally learning how to read between the lines to find them again.
It's an incredible process of rediscovery.
Well, thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. We hope it gave you a completely new perspective on history, the mechanics of survival, and the hidden power of the names we carry with us every day.
Keep questioning the records and keep looking deeper.
We will see you on the next deep dive.